David, if I can hand over to you and take it away.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody for giving me this opportunity to chat with you. It's kind of, we're 7 hours difference. I'm in Calgary, Alberta today, and so it actually is the first time I've done a speech in my pajamas. That's also, I have difficulty with the speaker. I can't round and my hand, so we'll see where we go.
David, you're breaking up a little bit. I don't know if it's our end or your end.
Okay, is this better?
That's much better, yeah.
Okay, so I'll just get a bit closer here, and then we'll put up with the funny video, I guess. One of the things that's interesting to me is in this week, I was in Ottawa for a conference on social responsibility 2 days ago, and today in Calgary for Social Enterprise Awards, and then next week is the Social Enterprise Conference in Canada, where we actually have one of your colleagues from the UK, Jerry Higgins, joining us from Scotland. This is really an interesting and amazing kind of situation we're in right now. Today I'd like to talk about is first the dramatic economic times we're engaged in, and how I think that opportunity is really key for us in the social enterprise sector. Second, just a few thoughts about how social enterprise can be, I think, a determining factor in how the future goes forward. And third, I actually have some favors that I'd like to ask of you at the Welch conference. But first, let me talk a little bit about how I'm looking at the current economic times that we're in. Doing some research for an article I'm working on, I actually was reading Karl Marx recently, and there was a great quote that I got from him, and he said, in 1866, he said, "No period of modern society is so favorable for the study of capitalist accumulation as the period of the last 20 years. That was 1846 to 1866. So I wonder what he would say about the last 20 years that we've gone through in terms of accumulation of capital. So when I start to think about that, how do we start to look at the last 20 years, what has happened economically, and how do we start to look at the next 20 years? And I really believe that we're actually right now in a situation where we're reshaping the culture of business. I mean, when you hear Duncan talk about, one, and that's a new culture of business. And we're really seeing an emerging and significant economic times that are no longer just about capital accumulation, but more and more we're talking about blended value economy in the business activity. And I think there's two things that are influencing that change. One of them is the demand, which, because people are starting to say, I want to have these products that have not just, economic value, but I also want to have some other values. And the other then side is, the supply side. And so we start to talk about when we create this demand and supply. And then there's two pieces that I think that are creating new influence. One is the environmental movement, and the other one is how we're trying to address the complex social issues that just are not being solved in the traditional methods at all. The environmental movement, I think, is a key influencer. 41 years ago is when we saw the first Earth Day. And since that, in the last, how many, years, especially the last 20, environmental issues have moved to the forefront in product development. I mean, Nike went from the target of consumer boycotts to now, being touted as an innovating, recycler on the planet. So what really became as this little community-based, morally driven effort is now like an everyday practice. So I look at my office when I am there, and my wastebasket is a little tiny, one, container, and my recycling bucket is huge. And I suspect 10 years ago it was the opposite. And the other day I sat on a panel with someone who works in CSR at a very major bank in Canada, and he was talking about their decisions of buying some material for a new building, and he said, 10 years ago the decision would have been, what's the best price? And he said, there they were looking at, okay, well, we can get it from China, we can get it from Europe, we can get it from Canada. What's the price, but what's the footprint, and which company takes care of their workers? And so all of a sudden he said, it's no longer for them as a business to look at purchasing to say, oh, what's the best price? But they're actually, talking about, what's the blended value, what's the impact, the ripples are purchasing. And it was interesting, in Public Review in February, Mike Porter and Mark Kramer just wrote an article this past spring about, the shared values proposition for the private sector. And if business doesn't care about their community, they're not going to be successful. They're starting to change the culture and the language in business. And I believe that in the next 20 years, we actually have the potential to sort of make some dramatic impacts. And especially because social enterprise, actually, we're holding these values by what we do. So the opportunities for us to be on the vanguard of this new economic movement is so huge that we've got to do it right. We've got to create the right collaboration. We've got to create the right supportive environment. But we also have to create the right products with the right social value that will meet the growing demand, that we can actually talk about when are we going to, that tipping point where blended value is really what people are choosing, and they actually have the opportunity to make the choice because we're providing the right products at the right prices with the right quality. So I think there's a couple things that I think we've got to be really careful about. We've got to be vigilant in creating and demonstrating and producing that, because we can't just say we're doing good. We've got to have the products and the services to be competitive in the marketplace, and we've got to be able to show social value. We're starting to see some shifts in business when they're doing things like requests for proposals. You're in UK and Glasgow, with the games coming up, putting in community benefit agreements on all of their requests for proposals. It's really becoming a new model. In the 2010 Winter Olympics that were in Vancouver last year, the flowers that were handed out to the award winners came from a social enterprise because the Olympic Games actually put a social value in how they evaluated the bids. So I think our challenge is how do we move this game up to the next level, and how do we become so market savvy and product capable and customer driven that we take advantage of this opportunity. And how do we, it's interesting, someone just, as Lisa just said, how do we stop looking at this as a grant-driven thing to a sales-driven model? I was really disappointed recently. A really successful social enterprise in Vancouver recently ran an ad to hire a fundraiser. I thought, oh, that's really probably not the direction I would want to go and see where we're going. Why aren't we hiring marketing people, and why aren't we competing on the business level? And that sort of takes me to talking a bit about the Canadian context. And it's interesting that Liam spoke at your conference yesterday. It was actually back in 2007 at the second Canadian Conference on Social Enterprise. We had Liam speaking, and we had Jonathan Bland, and you can imagine that was great advice and two really different approaches. Really good balance, if you want to talk about how Lisa talked about balance. But what we did is we took the advice from the UK, and then we went into our own process, and we created what we're looking at is how do you create a supportive environment for social enterprise? And we came up with 4 key areas. One of them is we have to be able to demonstrate our value. I mean, what evidence do we have, and what can we show people and demonstrate our social impact that we're delivering in our social enterprises? And then we realize that in Canada, a lot of the social enterprises are coming out of the nonprofit sector. So we really have to build the business skills of the nonprofit sector. They're really great at social program delivery, but often not so experienced. So how do we build those skills? We have to have the right capital at the right time in the business development path. And fourth, we really have to increase the market and purchasing opportunities. How do we build things like social purchasing portals? How do we create intermediaries and market opportunities? So we have to have a framework that allows us to create the policy and the practices and the systems that will support social enterprise. And so my last point today is I want to ask a big favor of all of you at the Welsh Social Enterprise Conference. Because here in Canada, it seems like whatever you do over there in the UK somehow ends up being our model for practice in Canada. I'll give you a couple examples. The definition of charity was first described in the British law in the reign of Elizabeth I, when the Statute of Charitable Use was enacted in 1601. Charity was defined. We have the same definition of charity based on your law from 1601. The most recent thing that happened is one of our federal ministers went over to the UK and came back and said, I've solved the problem of social complex problems. We're going to do social impact bonds. So it seems like if you guys have an idea, it moves over here. So I have a favor to ask. Can I ask you to do, like, come out of your conference with some things that you're going to do, because if you do them, then we can say, oh, they're doing it in Wales, let's do it here. I think that. So if you update your Charities Act to actually encourage more business-like activity in the charitable sector, I think after 500 years, we're due for a refreshment. Can you require social benefit clauses in all purchases over $250,000 by government? Because if we can put in community benefit agreements to funding from the government, I think we'll move social enterprise forward, and then the private sector will follow and the nonprofit sector will follow. I think we have to really build a comprehensive system to support the development of the business skills. So as much as you can do to support that, I think that will be great. We'll look at your examples. We'll be able to move them here. Can you put some tax credits in place for social enterprise patient capital investors? And, keep sharing the stories about, what one is doing and what other, private sector businesses are doing around CSR and around incorporating social values into their business practices. And I think the last one is, and it's great to hear this discussion that you're having about driving with blended values, because I think what we're learning together is that we actually are working on this blended value proposition. And I think that, if we go back to, looking at 20-year spans in economics, and as Marx was doing, I think that 20 years from now, we actually have the opportunity where we'll be the influencing element. And we have this opportunity, and we have a huge challenge. And so I think that's what we share between your conference and the conferences going on this week in Canada, is we're all trying to figure out is how can we move this sector forward to being a real important factor within determining how our communities will be healthy in the future. So thanks very much for the chance to share some thoughts with you this morning.